Now, the SEGA Game Gear is a pretty forward-thinking system overall from SEGA. Sure, it didn't do as well as the Game Boy. In fact, the Game Boy pretty much ran it over pretty easily. Of course, things like Pokemon, which actually debuted after this was discontinued, now I think about it. But the Game Boy had a lot of advantages over this Game Gear. But the Game Gear had a ton of advantages over the Game Boy. But still, they could not seem to get this off the ground to compete with the Game Boy. But today we're going to take a look at the Game Gear and why I think it's actually one of SEGA's most forward-thinking systems that they've ever come out with. Sure, the Dreamcast is touted as a system ahead of its time with its high-definition visuals, the modem that came with it to give you online play, and even the VMUs acting as a second screen on your controller. See, SEGA had a ton of good ideas with that system, but I look at the Game Gear and this was seriously SEGA pulling stuff out of the future and trying to make it work in 1991. Now, to really understand how far ahead of its time this system was, we have to go back to 1986 when the Master System came out. See, at the time, it was the NES that kind of came onto the scene and brought games back from that video game crash that took place a few years before. Here's the NES, everyone's buying game systems again, so SEGA shows up with their Master System in '86, and from then on, we had pretty much the console wars between Nintendo and SEGA, up until Sony entered the scene and just started messing up both of them, just kind of squashing both of them. But at that point, in the early 90s, it was SEGA versus Nintendo. So, of course, Nintendo comes out with their handheld, the Game Boy, in 1989, and SEGA responds with the Game Gear. And this is the first time that I can remember, really looking back on it, that they tried to make it so you could play console-grade games on a handheld. Yeah, remember how we talk about that now with things like the Vita and now the Nintendo Switch? This was the first time that they made home console games work on batteries. I mean, literally, there was an adapter to let you play Master System games on this device. Of course, the Sega Genesis had come out 2 years before this, as this came out in '91. The Genesis came out, or the Mega Drive overseas, and that really took over the market alongside the Super Nintendo, and it really helped SEGA start to pull market share from Nintendo with, of course, Sonic, and then they had the Sega CD, and then the 32X. Whether you like them or not, they still helped SEGA big time to really start to push Nintendo around a bit. Of course, Super Nintendo came out, that ended up succeeding, but the Game Gear actually ended up lasting until about 1997. So the question, I guess, is, and we're going to answer that today, is why did it end up failing and what happened here? Because for some reason, this is a system that people will tell you was way better than Game Boy, but just couldn't compete with it. So let's get this thing apart and kind of talk about it a bit while we're breaking it down. And I guess the first thing that people realize right away with this system is the battery life and the cost to play this. See, it's not like how it is now, where if your system dies, you plug it in, right? That's it. Okay, I'm playing my Switch. Oh, okay, I played a couple hours of Zelda. It's getting low on battery. I'm going to plug it in and I'll pick it back up after it's done charging, or I'll play it while it's charging. It's a bit different. You had to use batteries back in the early 90s, actually through most of the 90s, you had to use batteries, and that was a bit of an issue because this one used 6 AA batteries, and the battery life was somewhere between 3 and 5 hours seems to be the consensus. But I would expect to see 3 to 4 hours just to be realistic. But it depends on what game you're playing as well. And then you had to buy a whole nother pack of batteries. So think about that if you're either a younger kid or a parent. If you're a parent, you're spending money almost every other day to get batteries so that your kids could play this thing. And if you're a kid, once you're out of batteries in the household, this becomes pretty much useless. So I went ahead and moved you guys to a bit of a better spot so you can get a better look at what's going on here. First of all, if you're going to buy a Game Gear, you definitely want to get the hottest accessories on the market, since, of course, this is a pretty small screen, right? You need to be able to see it better. Well, check this out. They got you covered. This is actually what we had to do, guys, back in the 90s. I'm not kidding. This is very real, what you're seeing right now. This is called, let me lock that sucker on. There we go. This is called the Super Wide Gear, and it would basically magnify it so you could, I guess, see it better. And oh yeah, look at that. Very, very portable now, right? This is what we did. The Game Boy had something kind of like this as well. You might remember this one was just so obnoxious and hilarious at the time that I would actually see people use this. I'm not kidding. This was a thing. So it was just really funny. Actually, I got this with this Game Gear, and I thought it'd be funny to show. So there you go. Look for the hottest accessories you can find. They even had clip-on batteries. So you could actually clip a battery to your belt and then plug it in like it was like a battery bank or something, basically. And the Game Boy had one as well, and it looked so ridiculous at the time. Now I look back on it, it's even worse. It's so funny. So a few things you want to look out for if you go to buy a Game Gear. I've actually repaired quite a few Game Gears, believe it or not, from people bringing them into the stores. That was a thing. Capacitors would leak all the time. But you definitely want to open up the battery compartments and look in here for any corrosion, as that's something I would always see as corrosion. Now this back panel is completely replaceable, but it's hard sometimes to get some of these parts that are clean, so you might as well look to make sure that it is as clean as possible before you do it, because trying to get it work from there is a real pain. So just double check all of that before you buy it. I would not recommend buying one online because you can't see it. They do use a game bit screw at the top, actually the same size as what you see on like the Genesis cartridges, and then the rest is actually all Phillips head screws, which is much easier, thankfully, than what we usually get with like Nintendo stuff, where it's like game bits and everything, and it's a real pain. No, just a bunch of Phillips head screws will get this apart. Okay, I got all the screws apart. Open it up, and you can see what I'm talking about here. This whole back part is actually plugged in and unplugs, so you can essentially replace the back as long as you have the same versions of the Game Gear. And you'll actually have your soundboard back here where you turn this up and down. And generally, like, these capacitors will leak and you have to replace them. And that's sometimes you need to do that to get your sound back and working, just because it runs through here. Sometimes like a headphone jack won't work, things like that. These capacitors leak very, very easily. It's the same with like a Turbo Duo or a Turbo Express. Just these capacitors from the early 90s were just, they just leak all over the place, and they're just not as good as like today's capacitors. Obviously, technology gets better, so that's going to happen. And you'll end up seeing that a lot with a lot of these different these Game Gears. All these capacitors will leak or could have internal problems, and that's why you'll get like dim screen or no picture at all on the screen, no sound. All of these things kind of contribute to that. So they do have capacitor replacement kits online, and these come off fairly easily. You actually twist them and pop them off, and then you just desolder the legs, and you can solder everything back down. And when you get that done, it works really well. Well, within reason, as we're going to kind of talk a bit about this system as we pull the motherboard out. Now, the interesting thing about this system, and the reason, as I'm sure many of you might be wondering, as to why the battery life is so poor. We were talking about 6 AA's, and it gets, 3 to 5 battery or hours for the battery life. Why is that? Why does it destroy batteries when the Game Boy, even the old brick Game Boy, would use 4, but it would get significant amount more? And we would even see things like the Game Boy Pocket eventually use AA's and get good battery life as well. Why did this one do so poorly? Well, the biggest thing that I have noticed, the thing that people have even figured out at this point because they've modified this system like crazy, is the way that they backlit this system. See, this was a fully backlit, fully colored screen, something that we didn't see Nintendo do until like a decade later with the SPs, to where they finally did that. Yeah, they did. Sega attempted to do it in '91. And that was a big issue because they had to use, and I'm not kidding, essentially a fluorescent bulb. You see those fluorescent bulbs that were being used in like stores and stuff, like those bars? That's what they used. In fact, right here, this going behind is one big fluorescent bulb. And that destroys battery life. It is bad. Like, the voltage on this thing is like super high, and it's so bad. People started replacing it with, let me get this off here, with LEDs, and they significantly, I mean like seriously, by almost 3 times. If you were getting like 3 to 5 hours, people are getting like anywhere from 10 to 15 hours, depending on what you're doing. It's crazy how much different it is when you just pull that out. And here we are with our screen, and this is interesting as well. People have started even replacing these screens with like full colored screens and everything, and they look much better. This screen was a pain because of the ghosting and the washed out look. It was very ahead of its time, but technology was certainly not there, but Sega tried their hardest to make it work. And they had this vision, I think, of actual home console games on the go. And I'm gonna show you why actually real quick. So you're seeing 2 chips here. This one is 8 kilobytes of SRAM, and directly next to it is probably the most interesting thing about the Game Gear, next to the fluorescent tube that uses up all that battery power, and that's the Z80 CPU. It's actually a chip that was in the Master System. So what Sega effectively did here was, after 5 years of the Master System being on the market, they took that system and turned it into a portable. This uses the same amount of RAM with 8 kilobytes of SRAM and then 16 kilobytes of VRAM. Uses the same CPU. I think it's clocked slightly lower, but they're still using that same CPU. A fluorescent tube and then a fully colored backlit screen. And they made it all portable. Of course, it runs on 6AA's and destroys them in hours, but it was pretty fascinating to see this as they pretty much took their home console from the generation prior and turned it into a handheld. That's why you have that adapter that lets you play Master System games on this thing, because this is effectively a Master System. Like, this whole thing is basically just them saying, well, you know, we could turn that Master System into a handheld and try to sell it and go the power route against the Game Boy. The problem was it was big and bulky. Sure, the brick Game Boy was as well, but it was more portable than this thing. And the cost of having this device, unless you, of course, plugged into a wall, which kind of defeats the purpose of it, it was just so high. Having to buy 6 AA's almost every other day if you're really playing a game is insane to ask from your customers, but that was just the way in the 90s. This was something that Sega really looked at and said, let's get forward thinking about this. And they outran themselves. They outran everybody in the 90s with the technology that was available at the time. And I also noticed I didn't really have to take much apart. There's really not a lot to do to get to the board of the Game Gear as you're seeing. Going any further would involve me ripping the screen off. And I would probably do that if I wanted to replace the screen, because there are some really cool mods out there. People are pulling this the fluorescent tube out, replacing it with LEDs. Some people even have full-on screens you can get now that replace this whole thing with a much better looking screen. Battery life goes through the roof with any of those mods, and it just makes the experience way better. But people should realize that what Sega was trying to do here was interesting from a technology standpoint. It just wasn't great from a quality of life standpoint. And Nintendo ran past them with, of course, their IPs with Mario. Eventually, Pokemon really made the Game Boy jump. And it was just something that Sega just could never compete with. But it was really cool to see something like this happen. They even had a TV tuner that let you watch TV on this thing. Seriously, Sega was thinking of anything and everything to make this interesting to people. But the battery life and even the poor quality of the screen, I would argue, it just wasn't there for them at the time. And eventually this thing was discontinued in 97, sold just over 10 million units. So while not like a colossal failure, it certainly wasn't on the level of that Game Boy. And guys, that's going to do it here for the Game Gear look. I had a lot of fun taking it apart and checking it out and everything. I hope this gave you a better idea of the Game Gear, what happened to it, why it failed, and why it was pretty cool, why it was pretty far ahead of its time. And with the modding scene really wrapping around it now, it might be worth picking one of these up. You just have to watch out for some of the stuff we talked about, like the capacitors failing or leaking or corrosion in the battery casing. Those are things you want to look at before you buy a used Game Gear, and I'd be a bit careful about buying them online without actually examining it. So if you have like a local mom and pop video game store, retro store around you, or there's a convention you can go to, that's probably the better place to pick it up rather than order online and potentially get one that is irreparable, pretty much, unrepairable. So look out for that, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you guys give this video a like if you liked it, dislike if not, and I'll see you guys in the next video.